Better in Bucharest is a podcast about life experiences, leadership lessons, faith, and hope. This podcast will show you that you don't have to compromise your values to achieve happiness. So, my guest for today is Jerry Ruth. It's an honor to have you here, Jerry. Thank you for coming to Romania, and I can't wait to hear more about your wisdom and your knowledge on Christianity and C.S. Lewis. So, welcome.
Thank you, Yanuts. I'm grateful. You mentioned you're eager to hear about my wisdom. I am a full professor in America, and I have discovered, being around academics, that nobody is more than a pea brain. There are millions of books out there, and no matter how many books any human has read, there are millions more they haven't touched. We're very limited in our understanding. It's good for us to remember that.
So humble of you to say this. Jerry, if I will ask you to describe yourself in 20 seconds, what would you tell me?
I am married to my wife, Claudia. I love her. We have 4 married children, 15 grandchildren. For career, I am a professor. Most of my academic area has been in the study of C.S. Lewis. Most of the books I have written are about C.S. Lewis, and I've lectured on C.S. Lewis at 79 universities in 19 different countries. So I've written many things, I've lectured on him, but I also am concerned about sharing faith as Lewis was in a multiple number of ways. And so this is what drives me. Why
C.S. Lewis? Why did you are an expert on C.S. Lewis? Why do you have the same passion to share the faith as him did it?
When I went to university, I was not a Christian. We were poor and came from a poor part of Los Angeles, a rough part of Los Angeles. And many didn't go to college from where I grew up. But I went because back then I was a sportsman. I played American football. And so I went to college to play football. I did not have good grades. I just stayed at the bare minimum I needed to have to go and play. And I was invited the first week of school to a Campus Crusade for Christ, now called Cru, meeting. And I heard the gospel for the first time. And I was overwhelmed that God loved me and forgave me. I didn't have to have somebody tell me I needed to be forgiven. I was well aware. And I wanted everybody to know this. So I shared Christ with every person I played football with in university every year and saw about 15 guys a year come to Christ. As I would share Christ, people would ask me questions, and they were good questions. I didn't know the answers. So I would go and dig for the answers. No question ever ends a conversation. It opens the door for the conversation to continue if you do hard work and find the answers and go back to the person and say, you matter to me. I want you to know that I took seriously what you asked. And a name would creep up in all of the literature. C.S. Lewis, he had these brilliant answers to questions. So I started reading him, and I found that he was helpful in me understanding my own faith. When I graduated from university, a person wisely said to me, you did not get an education in university. You laid a foundation for one. Now your responsibility is to build on that foundation. Pick an author who will take you places and make that author your life study. So I went to graduate school and studied theology. When I became a Christian, because my mind woke up, I was reading my Bible, I was reading other books, I was growing in my faith, and C.S. Lewis, who's known for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, opens more than wardrobe doors. He wrote 73 books about hosts of subjects. You read him, you'll want to read the books he refers to, and I was expanding in my understanding of things. When I went to graduate school, I wrote my thesis on C.S. Lewis for my master's degree. Later, I went and did a PhD and wrote on C.S. Lewis and the problem of evil. And I began to grow and read and write and think, and I think it's been very helpful to me because I love God. And I think everybody needs to know that God loves them. And if you go talk to people, it's helpful if you have a resource that can give you ways to think through the various questions people might ask. And so consequently, the connection of C.S. Lewis and sharing Christ with others is a natural link.
Speaking about God loving us, I have friends who they are not satisfied by the answers of Christianity. For example, in the area of suffering, if God is good, why do we see a lot of suffering? So they think that they embrace the other perspective, or one of the other perspective. They say, well, suffering it will make you stronger, and when you'll be reincarnated, you'll be a much stronger person or soul. What can you comment on this?
Well, first off, the issue of suffering is a problem not just for Christians, it's a problem for materialists as well. If materialists believe there is no transcendence, there's no metaphysical origin for the universe, and that we're just a consequence of atoms bouncing around and so on, somehow organize themselves, where did they get the concept of good? C.S. Lewis writes about this. Why would you expect good if there's no foundation for goodness? So if I begin there and I say, well, God maybe is the foundation for goodness, now how do I explain evil? That's where the problem comes for the Christians. But the materialists shouldn't be let off the hook. They should be pressed. Why do you expect goodness in this universe? But like you mentioned, some people say, well, suffering can produce strength and character. There's a whole tradition in Christian work. Theodicy is the word we use to describe in philosophy and theology this concept of how do we answer the problem of evil. It comes from two Greek words, theos meaning God and dike meaning justice or righteousness. How do we justify God's existence given this evil? One form of theodicy is from the tradition of Saint Irenaeus, who said there is a soul-making theodicy. We see it all around us. We see the person who suffers as they begin a business because they don't know very much and they're trying to put it together, but they see that through that suffering the business begins to grow and they gain wisdom. We see it when a woman gives birth to a child. Through the suffering, something good comes. We see it with the athlete who trains hard, and in the discipline and in the suffering, good comes. We see it with physicians who take a scalpel and cut into a person, but they remove the cancer that's threatening the life. We see how suffering can produce good. So that's one form. The other form comes from Boethius, the author of the Consolation of Philosophy, one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages, and also from Augustine in the Confessions, in the City of God, in the Enchiridion, where he writes about what we know as a free will theodicy, that a lot of evil in the universe is a consequence of the ill use of free will. And that evil, too, as we understand it, is not primary. Evil is a perversion of the good. You can't think of a bad banana without thinking of a good banana that went bad. C.S. Lewis, when he writes about these things, says that evil compares to good like bread mold compares to bread. But we, who are made in the image of a creative God, can take bread mold and make something good out of it. We can make penicillin. Will we not allow God at least that level of creativity? Could he not take even the evil that's a consequence of jealousies, petty bitternesses, pride, arrogance, the kinds of acts of human will that have created havoc for people throughout centuries? Could he not even in that situation work and make divine penicillin even out of the bad that has happened? And in fact, Christians would assert God has done that. He didn't avoid the world. He didn't avoid people who have done bad things. He entered into that world. And at the cross, we see God's answer to the problem of evil. Christ is willing to enter in and assume the evil of man and to forgive that evil and to extend graces that make it possible for us to let go of the bad motives that cause us to, by virtue of free will, engage in bad acts, and also give us the motivation to continue on, that through the suffering we endure, virtue could emerge. Now, in a podcast, we can't go into all of this.
Yeah.
But I've read well over 600 books on this topic, and I'm hardly scratching the surface. So a lot of people are dismissive, and they haven't studied it very much. My doctoral dissertation, as I mentioned, is on this topic. And I know that a lot of people are quick to dismiss what God's doing, and when I query them a little bit, they lack the humility of knowing they really don't know that much about it, and they're willing to dismiss it so quickly rather than say, this is an intriguing topic, and it's worth really leaning into, that I might understand it better and better, because human history is full of the fact that we are questing to understand this better.
Logically, but emotionally, how do they make sense of this?
Again, I would say it's difficult to make a judgment in a moment and think that that judgment in the moment can give the answer for the developing problem. We are people in process. Human experience is dynamic, not static. We are not people who are inert. So picking up my lead from C.S. Lewis, I often ask people in those contexts, I want you to think of the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Once they get it in their mind, I say, now think of the next worst thing. Now think of the next worst thing. Now think of the next worst thing. I have asked this in Romania. I used to ask it. I used to teach in underground schools in Romania during the Ceausescu era to rooms full of people who had all suffered for their faith. Nobody got to more than 10. I asked it in Sudan to southern Sudanese tribal people, Christians who had suffered by the Janjaweed. Many of them saw relatives hacked to death. Nobody ever got to more than 10 really bad things in their life. But let's say you got to 20 or 30. Now think of all the good things that have happened to you. And that second list goes on and on and on. The bad we've experienced are horrible brushstrokes across a massive canvas of good. So as we think of those things, those bad things that happened to us, I will often ask a person, given time, did you ever see any good come out of some of the bad that you suffered? I've got 8 bad things. I've seen good come from 5 of them. Maybe they weren't resolved, but I learned some wisdom through that situation. My heart increased and I learned some empathy for other people who suffered. 100% of the people I've asked that have said, oh yeah, I saw good come over time. If you saw good come over time with some of the things, then you have good reason to believe perhaps good could come to all of them given eternity. But you have no good reason to say no good could ever come from this event in the moment, because your own experience counts against that judgment. But a lot of times we're willing to let our judgment of the moment transcend the whole picture, and it's not wise. It's like the person who thinks, the atheist, for example, who says there's no possibility God could exist. And I go, what do you know? Harvard University has 19 million volumes under the one roof of the Widener Library. I said, how many of those books have you read? Can you tell me for sure that there's nothing in any of those books that counts against what you think about in your little pea brain in this moment? And yet we make these universal judgments that are so self-referential, so arrogant and proud. And I say, it's better to have the humility. Give me an honest agnostic who says, I don't really know, I'm scratching my head, than the atheist who, from their limited perspective, make this universal judgment. And I think it's with the problem of evil, too. This is something we have to think about. No matter what you know about it, there's more to know. The truth you know, the sure word you know, it's not a last word. You can always plumb the truth more deeply. You could see applications more widely, even to questions about it you haven't begun to ask. And you could understand these in relationships with other things that you know. It seems to me that kind of humility helps us if we really want to know the answer and not just complain.
That's so good, Jerry. I want you said that you've been to Romania and speak on these topics. How did you find Romania in the 80s, or how were the people back then regarding this? Because they were living in a totalitarian regime.
Yeah. One time I was actually hassled by the secret police while I was here, 6 to 8 hours. It was terribly uncomfortable. And I thought to myself, I get to leave here, but these people have to live with us 24/7. And my respect for the Romanian people increased because they were suffering. And consequently, as a result of that, I found the situation under totalitarianism very difficult. But I found the people in many cases, were heroic. You can always find people, too, if they suffer, they'll get bitter and they'll get belligerent and they'll get calloused and angry. But most of the people I found were becoming, in those environments, sweet-spirited, concerned for others around them who were suffering as well, and so on. I was very impressed with Romania, and I've been back many, many times.
That's great. I want to continue the conversation, Jerry, speaking about, because Romania was under communism and, of course, atheism was pushed on people. Now we have freedom, but I see many people being skeptical about Christianity for many reasons. What would you tell them?
Well, the issues, again, are complex. One size doesn't fit all. I want to try to understand what is it that might be bothering this particular person. Some people are dismissive about theology and prefer embracing atheism because they're lazy. They don't want to do the study. Some of them don't want anything to do with Christianity because they've been wounded by somebody who claimed to be a Christian and hurt them. In that situation, I know the answer. If it's laziness, I want to say, come on, you've got to be honest with yourself and with others. Dishonesty with yourself isn't going to help you. But if they've been wounded by others, I want to say, tell me your story. And if they tell me their story and I hear the sadness in it, then I say to them, you know what, I'm a Christian. And I want to stand as a surrogate in the place of the person who hurt you. Not to excuse what they did, but to ask your forgiveness for what they did. And I want to ask your forgiveness because I wouldn't want anything that anybody else did to keep you from seeing how deeply you are loved by God. So I think you can go that route with that person who's been hurt because the hurt is real. It needs to be addressed. Some people, they don't know. And so consequently, they haven't yet got the interest in trying to study and go deeper. I'm an academic. I come from an academic world. If there's a curiosity, I want to explore it. I want to discover. What can I find out? I don't want to sit inert and just let it be. And the thing is, if there is a God, there's nothing more important in the universe than that. And if there isn't a God, then it doesn't mean anything. But the one thing we can't do is say, well, we could just be moderately interested. This is either the most important thing or it's not of any use whatsoever. So consequently, I would say, is there a place that maybe your reason for atheism is you just are ignorant about these things? C.S. Lewis made this observation. Negative knowledge is harder to assert than positive knowledge, always. So for me to say there's no spider in this room, I would have to search every nook and cranny to make the judgment. But to say there is a spider, I could see one scurrying across the floor. I don't have to have as much knowledge to make a positive assertion. Now, arguing the existence of God is more complex than saying there's a spider crawling across the floor. But the image, the analogy shows you how difficult it is for these people to be utterly dismissive about some topic that's so big when they know so little. So I think that this is an important way. I want to find out what is it that drives the objection and then try and address that appropriately. Is it an emotional issue? Sometimes, too, it's a moral issue. Sometimes a person's not interested in God. I met one of the most notorious atheists in America. Her name was Madeleine Murray O'Hare. We talked for an hour, one-on-one like this. And she made it very clear to me her reason for being an atheist was because she was promiscuous, and she chose to continue to be promiscuous. She didn't want anything to do with anything that would be a difficulty for her promiscuity. Sometimes that's a thing, too, that drives people.
I agree with this. But some people, they see Christianity, so they like what they do. They live maybe in a sinful life. But they say, oh, look, if I go to Christ, I need to give up on these things. And Christianity is not so much attractive. What can you say about this?
Well, I would have to ask, again, these things are complex. I'd have to explore with the person. You say not effective. What do you mean by that?
Not effective, attractive.
Attractive. What do you mean by that? C.S. Lewis said, I didn't come to God because I thought I would feel better. He says a bottle of port would do that for me better. He said, I came to God because I thought it was true. So the question is, does truth matter in these situations? If I say, well, if it's true, I'll follow it as long as there's never going to be any pain or any difficulty or any complexity, then I'll follow it. Well, that's then you determining for yourself what truth is, not you following truth wherever it leads. So this becomes a significant thing. And so I would want to explore that with that person, find out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, like, you can enjoy the things of the world, like everything. But if you go to Christianity, then they have this imagine that it's boring. It's you are now just have to study the Bible, take God seriously, and just they don't like it.
Well, that's not Christianity, actually. I've been a Christian for many, many years. That's not Christianity. It's a projection on Christianity. I don't want to reject something because I projected on it. In informal fallacies and logic, it's called a straw man argument.
Mm-hmm.
You portray the other person in a way that makes it easy for you to reject them. But you can talk to all kinds of people, even people who have suffered for the faith, and they'll tell you there was some sort of deep-seated joy, even as they follow God in difficult circumstances. And you can talk to other people who say, I found greater joy in this than not. So let's say you have a person who likes to go to bars and likes to find somebody to sleep with that night. They say, that's where the joy is. I say, I don't know a person who's done that sort of bar thing, who hasn't hurt all kinds of people as they took advantage of them for their own self-gratification. And I don't know a person who's married that doesn't enjoy sex more frequently than the person who's going at the bar all the time. So now all of a sudden the discussion becomes more complex, and we begin to look at that. Now, I've met Christians who have bad marriages. So consequently, I have to ask, is that because they're a Christian, or is it because even as a Christian they could do stupid things? And my own experience says no Christians are capable of doing stupid things, just as secular people are capable of doing stupid things. Let's learn how to be less stupid.
Jerry, I have some people in my life that they say that, okay, this Christian way of life that you preach is not livable in the real life.
The person who's willing to hold a grudge against others, the person who's willing to manipulate and cheat and connive in order to get ahead, is usually a person who will become jaded, will become bitter, and will become insensitive to other people. They become self-referential, and as they become self-referential, they diminish the capacity to have real relationship with others. You may be hurt at times, but the way to get past the hurt is to forgive. So I've met people who, they'll talk to me about something somebody did to them 20 years ago. And that person who hurt them may be dead and buried, but they're still giving complete control of their emotional life to that person who hurt them. And I go, I don't see how your bitterness is better than a person who's learned to forgive. And the capacity to forgive is always enhanced by learning about forgiveness first between us and God, that God forgives us. We draw on that rich resource. The life is better to be a forgiving person, a patient person, a loving person, a kind person, than the person who says, people have treated me bad, I'm going to treat other people badly too. It's nonsense. Absolutely nonsense. It doesn't work definitionally. The inferences that we draw from that lead to conclusions that are not good.
So, Jerry, I see in these days that people don't stick with one worldview. It's more like a combination of, well, they love the idea of helping elder people, helping the society, but in the same time, they don't want to have God in their life. And they say, oh, no God, but I like the principles of the Christianity. What's your take?
Well, you've asked basically two questions.
Yes.
One, I would say, whenever we talk about anything and we try to abstract from the particulars and generalize and come up with an understanding of something, that understanding may be very helpful. It may account for a lot of the particulars, but there's always going to be more particulars that are going to come that we're going to have to think through. Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he said science is always in a state of change because new discoveries are always coming. And so the paradigms have to shift or change. Now the question is, what kind of change is necessary? A change of kind, I totally have to scrap the old way of thinking, or a change of degree, like a tree that adds more rings as it grows. So I have to understand there are ways of looking at things, and anything that will enhance my having a robust way. And maybe it means blending several different worldviews that come together. It might be helpful. So we think of the West a lot of times. We think of things in a linear fashion, sequentially. In the East, they think of things in a cyclical fashion. I have a friend who says, well, what if it's a helix? So it's got the characteristics of both cyclical and linear. And then you've got Deleuze, the French philosopher, says, what if it's like the rhizome, the roots that go into the ground, and one thing branches off to another, and another thing branches off to another, and so on. All these are models. They're approximations. They're not the thing itself. And we can always get better and better approximations and better models. A good academic life will help me to understand that you can engage in the academic life without coming up with patterns and generalizations so you can pass on a body of knowledge, but you also have to always account for the exceptions that keep the patterns honest. So I think that sort of thing is important. And then when you talk about the Christian feature, how did you say it again? That's half of the question I forgot. I was talking first about these combining of worldviews and stuff like that.
Yeah, I meant when, is that saying that Christianity, a lot of values that we have right now in the society came from Christianity, and people like to take some of those, but reject God and the source of those values.
It seems to me if a person is honest, they would recognize that these values are good. If I know what my nature is, and I know it hurts me if certain things happen to me, then I should know by that it's not good for me to do those things to another person. And so this idea of the golden rule that we get from Jesus' teaching in Matthew's gospel makes sense. It makes sense of life. Jesus said, do to others what you'd want them to do to you. Confucius in the Analects said, don't do to somebody else what you wouldn't want them to do to you. I could do Confucius' thing and never do anything for anybody. It's still better than hurting people. But nevertheless, this do to others what you'd want them to do is better. When I see this whole pattern, though, of these sort of moral laws that kind of govern the universe, and the moral laws that are operational and make sense and are attractive if they're looked at accurately, those moral laws themselves don't guarantee that I have the capacity to live that way. I may have high ideals. I believe in the high ideal of love, but there are times I've had sharp words with people I say I love most in the world. I believe in justice, but there have been times I've been unfair in my treatment of others. I didn't set out to be, but I realize in retrospect I had been. When we talk about Christianity, we're not talking about merely a moral code. We're talking about a resource in the grace of God to give us the ability to look honestly when we fail, to come to God with a request for grace and repentance, to be forgiven, to assess honestly what we've done so that we can learn from our mistakes. Even Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. So I end up in the examined life and I come to God for resources. My need for Christ is not casual. It's constant. Again, I played American football for years till I was 44 years old. And always after an American football game, you watch films of the game that week. And you evaluate and assess, how did you do? Where might you improve? Where might you do better? How do you prepare for next week's team? And you look at movies of the team you're going to play the next week. And you're always learning and growing on these things. And this examined life is a life that is a life better lived than one that's not. And if you see you need help, you'd go to the coach and say, Coach, I don't know what to do here. And the coach helps you. In some senses, the grace of God comes like a coach's insight. And then it goes even beyond that because he infuses us with the capacity to do better as we grow.
Jerry, let's speak about C.S. Lewis again. Can you share more about his conversion and his discussions with Tolkien?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, C.S. Lewis became an atheist when he was fairly young. He had been raised in a family where faith was something that was valued. His grandfather was the pastor of the church that he attended as a boy. He was baptized as a child and so on. But his mother got cancer when he was young. And he was told by well-meaning but misguided people at his church, if you pray for her, she'll get better. You can't give that guarantee to a child. But he prayed for her as if her health, her healing would come on the heels of his prayers. And she died. So he began to think this faith thing is a bunch of nonsense. He was born with deformity of thumbs. And so consequently, when he would go to the playground, he was not very good at sports and other kids would make fun of him. His friends would build things with their hands, but he had to content himself just to be writing about them. And as a child, didn't realize his writing skills that he was developing because of this handicap would be something that would serve him well later. It's very interesting to me. Again, you can't make the judgment in the moment what this means. So consequently, Lewis, by the time he was 12, claimed that he was an atheist. It was short-sighted, to be sure, but what was he an atheist of? Lewis would later write, I want God, not my idea of God. I want my neighbor, not my idea of my neighbor. I want myself, not my idea of myself. The God that he was told about, he should have been an atheist about, because that's not the God who is. And consequently, a lot of people don't reject God, they reject a poor caricature of God. And that's what Lewis had done. He also, though, had a profound longing that he sensed. He picked it up from the stories he read, he picked it up from beauty and so on. What's the object of the longing? And these things seemed to conflict in his soul. The intellectual questions he had and the longings of the heart. But where does he go with this? He gravitated towards the literature that gave voice to the longings, but he also gravitated to the literature that tried to keep him in the blindness of his philosophical speculation and his atheism. He began to see, though, that materialism as a worldview didn't work. The materialists would look at the lovers, and they would say, the man looks at the woman, she projects an image on the retina of his eye. It travels along the optic nerve, stimulates the brain, causes secretion of particular hormones. He says it's love. It's not. It's just chemistry. It's just matter. That's all. But the materialists always want you to believe that his explanation is something more. When in fact the materialist just looks at the lovers, they project an image on the retina of his eye, it travels along his optic nerve, causes a secretion of particular hormones, and he says it's a valid explanation. If love isn't a valid emotion, then his explanation isn't valid either for the same reason. And Lewis says, I can't believe reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. We know things are going on in the cerebral cortex, and we can even monitor those. But it's not enough to account for all that's going on. And Lewis rejected his materialism, ended up rejecting his atheism for reasons we've talked about earlier, and he becomes a theist. But he didn't think he could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare, Hamlet, the character in Shakespeare's play. During this time, he had cultivated a deep friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien. They used to translate the Icelandic sagas from the original Icelandic. They would talk about stories. Tolkien had been vulnerable with Lewis and shared with him this story he was writing. And even Tolkien said, The Lord of the Rings would have never come out had it not been for C.S. Lewis's encouragement all along the way. But while they shared their interest in story, this idea of the mythological, of the gods coming down and engaging in experiences with humans and stuff. Lewis was deeply moved by this, but he thought it was all myth. It was just story. It wasn't real. And one night he had a late night conversation with Tolkien. The essence of the conversation was, you like the stories whenever you read them. How come you won't accept the story at the one place where it reports to be real? In the historic incarnation of Christ, to this degree. Hamlet, the character of the play, could never break out of the play to get to know the author. But Shakespeare, the author, could have written himself into the play as a character and made the introduction between Hamlet and Shakespeare possible. And Lewis finally comes to a place where he says, I think that's what happened in the Incarnation, when God became a man. So it was largely due to Tolkien's conversation. It was Tolkien, Lewis said, who was the human cause of his conversion. And Lewis becomes a Christian.
He started to write The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Chronicles of Narnia. What do you like about the Chronicles of Narnia?
Well, first let me say the Chronicles of Narnia came long after Lewis's conversion. The first book he wrote after his conversion was a book called Pilgrim's Regress, and it was an allegory, the only allegory Lewis ever wrote. The Narnian books are not allegories. It was an allegory like Pilgrim's Progress of his own conversion, but he puts it in sort of fiction form. And then he also, shortly after that, started his reputation as a student of medieval and Renaissance literature. He wrote the Allegory of Love, which many considered was a complete paradigm shift on how people looked at the love allegory in medieval literature. He wrote English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, a book 700 pages long. To write that book, he read every book written in English in the 16th century.
So he did his work.
He did masterful work. He's considered one of the great literary critical historians of that period. So he's doing that. He's also writing science fiction, which came out way before Narnia. He wrote a work in educational philosophy called The Abolition of Man that Mortimer Adler, the philosopher at University of Chicago, included in the great books of the Western world with works like Plato and Aristotle and Homer and so on. So he's doing all this work. But all the while, he said, most of my books are evangelistic. What did he mean by that? It wasn't that he was trying to coerce or manipulate people to faith, but he said, we don't need more books by Christians about Christianity. We need more books by Christians about other subjects with their Christianity latent. So you can see the complexity of what a Christian worldview would be and how many areas of life it touches on and how satisfying what it has to say if it's looked at honestly and accurately. How satisfying that would be, rather than the person who just looks at a little bit of it and rejects the whole thing and doesn't understand it in its larger context. So then Lewis thinks, I think it would be interesting to imaginatively see what it would be like if I have an incarnation in a world where there are talking beasts and so on. And so he ends up writing these great stories for children. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Magician's Nephew, The Prince Caspian, and so on. They're wonderful.
Which one is your favorite?
Usually whichever one I'm reading at that moment. Yeah. I like The Voyage of the Dawn Treader because it's a pilgrimage book. Reepicheep, the most chivalrous mouse of that world, had a prophecy uttered over him when he was young that one day he would go to Aslan's country. And here's this voyage, a little bit like Ulysses. It's Lewis's basically taking Homer's Ulysses or Virgil's Aeneid and developing this voyage of trying to find Aslan's country.
One of the idea that, I see these days with COVID and a lot of people dying, they start to ask themselves, what about the afterlife? What's going to happen? And I know Lewis wrote a book on the idea of hell, The Great Divorce. It's So can you share more what was his view on the idea of afterlife? Yeah,
well, first off, The Great Divorce, he takes the title from William Blake's poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Earth, or Heaven and Hell. And Lewis says, I don't think there's a marriage between heaven and hell. I think there's a great divorce. But the book itself is sort of a satirical development off of Dante's Divine Comedy. You have these people who are in hell. Lewis finds himself as a character in the book, just like Dante found himself as a character in the Divine Comedy. He finds himself in hell, and he takes a bus ride to the threshold of heaven, which would be like purgatory. People come out of heaven and invite people to let go of whatever they're holding on to in God's place. So their security is a false security, and they're holding on to these things, but they keep them self-referential, not opened up to the wider world, and so on. So Lewis is just trying to develop what is it that we're holding on to. rather than accept the liberty that God asks us or offers to us in trusting him. So that's a big part of it. But COVID and afterlife and all this other stuff, when World War II broke out, the students at Oxford University, if you've gone there, I mean, I've studied there and so on, the walls of the colleges have etched in the walls the names of the people who died in World War I. World War II starts 21 years after World War I ended, and all these students see the etched in names, and they think, is my name going to be etched in these walls now? And all of them had uncles and relatives and people they had heard stories of that had died in that war. They all knew people who had been maimed in that war. And that was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and now we've got something far more mechanized and far more dangerous. And there was despair, and they asked Lewis to speak about it. And he gave a talk called De Futilitate at his chapel, of futility. If you say all is futile, what is the standard you are judging that by? All judgments imply a standard. If an architect draws a plan, we're here in Bucharest, and an architect in Timișoara draws a plan and sends it to us, and he says, cut the board at 2 meters. We've got to have an objective standard that would apply to what's going on in Timișoara and what's going on in Bucharest. So consequently, what's the objective standard by which you could judge this as futile? And he says, if you see a transcendent understanding, then there might be more going on than we realize. And here now we start thinking of the afterlife, and we think of the transcendent. So then that sermon helped those students at the college where he was teaching. So the university asked Lewis to come and give a talk to the whole university. And I know people that were at the talk, and they said the place was packed. Every square inch on the floor was filled with people. And he gave a talk called On Learning in Wartime. Why should you continue learning in a university when all of civilization is on the threshold of collapse? And Lewis said this: war does not increase death. He could have said disease, COVID doesn't increase death. Aging doesn't increase death. Accidents don't increase death, because death is total in every generation. 1 out of 1 dies. And consequently, as a result of that, Lewis says you're not ready to live life to the full until you've settled the death issue. And then after the war is over, and now we have the days of the Cold War, and all of civilization looks like it's on the threshold of collapse if there's a nuclear war. Lewis writes an essay called Living in an Atomic Age. And he says, living in an atomic age produces no new set of circumstances. Oh, here's a unique thing. There are atom bombs. But in the Middle Ages, you could have had an outbreak of the Black Death at any time. Or Vikings could have invaded your village at any time. Civilization has always been lived where the life and death issue is always at play. The real problem is not because life and death is always at play. The real problem is, why are people so foolish that they don't deal with this? And earlier than Lewis, you have Montaigne, the French essayist and philosopher, who wrote an essay called that to study philosophy is to learn to die. When I preached philosophy, I taught philosophy. I used to have all my students read that essay. I think they thought, yeah, I'd rather be dead than have to read this essay or something like that. But Montaigne and Pascal, who was a late contemporary of Montaigne, in the Pensées, they both write the same thing. If you knew you were going to die in a month, what would you do differently? The goal would be to say, I wouldn't do anything differently because I've already made those decisions and I'm living on purpose right now. And so Lewis, when he talked to the university students, said, you need to settle these death issues so that when a crisis comes up, it's not destroying you. You've already thought honestly and deeply about these issues. And he felt it eventually would lead to Christ. Now, Lewis is saying, in the larger perspective of death, there are consequences. What kind of life do I live? I have the hope of an eternal life with God, where there's joy, where there's depth, where there's no boredom. If God is infinite and we're finite, and maybe we have sin eradicated from our life so we see finally with clarity rather than our thinking being affected by our brokenness. We see with clarity, if I know 0 to 1,000 bits of information about the infinite God, how much more is there still to know? An infinite amount. If I know 0 to a billion bits, how much more is there still to know? An infinite amount. It will never be boring. It will always be intriguing and creating an exercise of my curiosities to ask the questions, the discoveries, the wonder, the awe, and that sort of thing. On the other hand, hell for Lewis is a place where people shut down. They don't want to know anything. They want to keep to themselves. They want to maintain their envies, their jealousies, and so on. And Lewis says that the God of the universe never stops loving people in hell. Matter of fact, we could say God never stopped loving Satan. He can't stop loving him. The scriptures say God is love. Satan's incorrigibility and evil doesn't diminish God's character. So what Lewis says also in one of his books, that evil is vociferous, like nuclear fission. It continues to proliferate. And Lewis says that hell is a tourniquet God places on evil. You can go this far and no further. And you don't want God? Okay. God in his kindness then will give you a place where you could be by yourself without him forever. And Lewis even goes on to say that he thinks that those in hell are rebels to the end and that the gates of hell are locked from the inside. God is magnanimous, but the gates of hell are locked from the inside. And actually, Job chapter 21 in the Bible says that. Those going to Sheol, the place of perdition, say to God, depart from us. We do not even desire the knowledge of thy ways. And it's very interesting to me, his view of this. And then you start reading other people in literature who wrote about hell, like John Milton and his Paradise Lost and all this sort of thing. The capital of hell in Milton's hell in Paradise Lost is pandemonium. It's a thing of confusion. But pandemonium in the Greek means all demons. It's a place of utter anarchy. Everybody wants their own will. And anarchists do not make good community people. Heaven is a place where there's peace, where there's relationship, where there's joy, where there's interdependency. Hell is a place where people want isolation. They don't want anybody else. They want to be their own God, their own king, have their own kingdom. But pretty soon they find out there's only one subject in that kingdom, and that's themselves. But one other thing about it. You reap what you sow. You sow wheat, you reap wheat. You sow barley, you reap barley. You sow corn, you reap corn. You sow self, you reap solitude. Nobody wants to be around you. And for Lewis, hell is a place of utter solitude. Heaven is a place of connection and relationship with God and with others.
Jerry, we are at the end. It was so great to have you today with us. I think I would love to continue another time this discussion with you. First of all, I was blessed to have this conversation with you. And I think for other people here in Romania will be a blessing too. So we are at the end. If you have just one more idea, recommendation, the floor is yours. The students are here. So, yeah, let me hear it.
Well, how about if I just say, before Lewis died, he received a letter from a little girl who was 11 years old. She had read the Narnian books, and she wrote to him through his publisher. He got the letter on his deathbed. And if he would have never written her back, no big deal. But he took time, this man who's almost ready to die, writing to this little girl who's just beginning to live. And here's what he said to her. If you continue to love Jesus, nothing much will go wrong with you. And I hope you may always do so. So let me leave you with Lewis's almost last words that he ever penned.